Stalingrad. The battle Hitler refused to let his army survive. An entire German army was trapped, starving and freezing to death in a city Hitler had ordered them never to leave. Their own commander begged for permission to retreat. Hitler promoted him to field marshal instead, on the unspoken assumption that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and that he would take his own life rather than become the first. He surrendered anyway. By the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, already the largest land campaign in military history, had pushed deep into southern Russia, with German forces advancing toward the industrial city of Stalingrad, a target of genuine strategic importance given its position along the Volga River and its role in Soviet oil and supply transport, but one that also carried enormous symbolic weight specifically because of its name, a city named directly after Stalin himself, making its capture or defense a matter of intense personal and propaganda significance for both Hitler and Stalin far beyond its strict military value. German forces under General Friedrich Paulus launched a massive assault on the city in August of 1942, initiating months of brutal, close-quarters urban combat that devolved into some of the most vicious, grinding fighting of the entire war, with German and Soviet forces fighting for control of individual buildings, floors, and even single rooms in combat so intimate and prolonged that soldiers on both sides later described the fighting as occurring almost constantly, day and night, across a devastated urban landscape that had been reduced to rubble within weeks of the assault's beginning. By November of 1942, German forces had captured the overwhelming majority of Stalingrad's urban area, appearing genuinely close to complete victory, when Soviet forces launched a massive, carefully planned counteroffensive codenamed Operation Uranus, striking not directly at the exhausted German forces engaged in the city itself, but at the weaker, less experienced Romanian and Hungarian units protecting the German army's extended flanks on either side of the city. A calculated strategic decision that allowed Soviet forces to break through these weaker positions and rapidly encircle the entire German Sixth Army, along with substantial additional Axis forces, trapping approximately 250,000 to 300,000 soldiers inside what became known as the Stalingrad Pocket. General Paulus, recognizing his army's increasingly desperate, deteriorating situation as Soviet forces tightened their encirclement and German supply lines were completely severed, requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout, a military maneuver that, while genuinely risky, represented the trapped army's only realistic chance of preserving a meaningful portion of its remaining forces. Hitler refused this request directly and explicitly, ordering Paulus and his forces to hold their position within the city regardless of the deteriorating tactical situation, a decision driven substantially by the same symbolic, propaganda-driven considerations that had made Stalingrad's initial capture so significant in the first place. Since abandoning the city Hitler had specifically targeted for its symbolic value would represent a devastating propaganda defeat, regardless of the actual military logic involved. The trapped German forces, cut off from resupply and dependent on an inadequate, unreliable aerial supply effort that never came close to delivering sufficient food, ammunition, or medical supplies, began suffering catastrophic losses from starvation, disease, and the brutal Russian winter cold. Conditions considerably worse than the fighting itself for a significant portion of the encirclement period. As soldiers, many still equipped with inadequate cold weather gear given the German High Command's earlier, overconfident assumptions about the campaign's expected duration, succumbed to frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation in devastating numbers even before Soviet forces launched their final assault to eliminate the pocket entirely. In late January of 1943, with his forces' situation having become genuinely hopeless, and with Soviet forces having split the remaining pocket into smaller, increasingly untenable positions, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a promotion widely understood by military historians studying the decision as a calculated, deliberate message rather than a genuine reward, since no German field marshal had ever previously surrendered in the entire history of the German military. An unbroken tradition, Hitler's promotion was specifically, implicitly intended to pressure Paulus into either fighting to the death or taking his own life, rather than becoming the first German field marshal in history to surrender to enemy forces. Paulus, facing the complete, irreversible collapse of his remaining forces and having concluded that continued resistance served no remaining military purpose beyond further, pointless loss of life among his already devastated troops, surrendered to Soviet forces on January 31, 1943, breaking the specific unstated expectation Hitler's promotion had been designed to enforce, and becoming the first German field marshal in history to surrender, a decision that reportedly infuriated Hitler considerably when he received the news. Viewing Paulus's survival and surrender as a personal, symbolic betrayal layered atop the military catastrophe itself. The Battle of Stalingrad's final toll proved genuinely catastrophic for German forces, with an estimated 800,000 to 850,000 German and Axis casualties across the entire campaign, including the roughly 91,000 German soldiers who survived to be taken prisoner following the final surrender, the overwhelming majority of whom would themselves die in brutal Soviet captivity over the following years, with only a small fraction, estimated at roughly 5,000 to 6,000 survivors, eventually returning to Germany after the war's conclusion, years or in some cases over a decade later. What makes Stalingrad endure as one of history's most significant military turning points isn't simply the staggering scale of casualties involved, genuinely catastrophic as that toll remains by any historical measure, but the specific way the battle's outcome fundamentally, permanently shifted the war's broader strategic momentum, marking the definitive end of Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front and the beginning of a sustained Soviet counteroffensive that would ultimately, over the following 2 years, push German forces entirely out of Soviet territory and eventually all the way back to Berlin itself, a strategic reversal historians widely consider the single most decisive turning point of the entire European war. If stories like this, where a symbolic obsession with a single city's name cost an army its entire existence, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to the grave details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.